The defamation lawsuit filed by one Shirley Teeter against Project Veritas and James Okeefe was recently dismissed, and it is impossible to understand what exactly is going on unless one understands what a directed verdict is. Directed verdict. It is time to drop the vlog. For those of you who don't know me, I am Viva Frei, a Montreal litigator turned YouTuber. I do these things called vlogs, VLAWGS, where we break down and analyze something that's going on in the news in terms that can be understood by lawyers and non-lawyers alike. Okay, that's my standard intro. I will stop doing the intro sooner than later because I think everybody knows what the vlog is. Excuse me. And ordinarily I make my joke about, for those of you who've been living under a rock because the news is so notorious. This sort of slipped under the radar even for people who were following the story. An individual named Shirley Teeter was suing Project Veritas and James Okeefe for defamation. For those of you who don't know what Project Veritas or who James Okeefe is, it's a conservative news outlet, and during the 2016 election, they made a name for themselves by going undercover and exposing what was going on in the Democratic election campaign. One of the stories they reported on was a story about an individual named Shirley Teeter, who's an elderly lady who got assaulted at a Trump rally. Project Veritas covered the story and then showed undercover footage that they had of one of the Democratic campaign organizers who was caught by this undercover camera talking about a strategy being used by the Democratic campaign called bird dogging. It basically is the tactic of hiring or promoting or encouraging activists to show up at the rallies of their political adversaries to start some kerfuffle, leading to an incident that allows the campaign to portray the other campaign in a negative light. And this individual was talking about a bird dogger who was an elderly lady from North Carolina who had COPD, who was one of their operatives, who showed up at a Trump rally ostensibly for the purposes of instigating a situation or an event. And one such event occurred. Project Veritas made the report detailing all of this, and although Shirley Teeter was not named by name, it is apparently sufficiently clear that that was who the campaign was talking about being their bird dog, or who was going to engage in bird dogging at a Trump rally. Shirley Teeter sued James Okeefe and Project Veritas for defamation because the reporting painted her in a negative light as an activist bird dogger, as opposed to a totally innocent victim who showed up at a Trump rally to protest and got assaulted by angry Trump supporters. Shirley Teeter opted for a trial by jury, and a federal judge just dismissed the lawsuit outright after the trial had been held, but before the jury could come to a decision. And I'm a lawyer, and I didn't understand what happened or how it happened, and I had to look into it because the articles I read didn't even mention the term directed verdict, let alone explain what it was, and that is critical in understanding what exactly happened. Let's open up the standard caveat.
Nothing in this video constitutes legal advice. It is for entertainment and educational purposes only. If you need an attorney, consult an attorney in your proper jurisdiction.
Okay, now that we got that out of the way, the second caveat. I am a Quebec commercial litigator. Quebec abolished civil trials by jury decades ago, so we no longer have trials by jury for civil matters, we only have it for criminal matters. So I have no practical experience as an attorney pleading before a jury. But I've been following this story loosely, and I understood that it was going to be a trial by jury, so when I heard that a judge dismissed the lawsuit, flags started going off in my head. How could this happen? How could a judge dismiss this lawsuit as opposed to the jury, whose very purpose it was to determine that very question? And in looking into it, I discovered that there's something called a directed verdict, which is the power of a judge to dismiss the lawsuit if evidence has not been adduced to an essential element of what is required to be proven in order to succeed on the merits or allow the jury to even adjudicate on the question. And in a way it makes sense. It's not just because something is a trial by jury that the jury gets to decide everything and anything related to the file. The jury does not decide whether to maintain or dismiss objections. The jury doesn't decide whether or not to recognize a witness as an expert witness. Despite being a trial by jury, the judge is what they call the gatekeeper of evidence. The judge allows or does not allow evidence to be adduced for the jury to consider. And if the judge determines that an essential fact has not been proven, that the evidence is not even there, the judge is not going to allow the jury to adjudicate on the fundamental question and potentially come to an untenable verdict because in the eyes of the judge, who is the gatekeeper of the evidence, there wasn't even sufficient evidence of the essential element in order to proceed to a verdict by jury. And in arriving at the decision to dismiss the defamation lawsuit, the judge came to the conclusion that no evidence had been adduced proving malice. Malice being a criteria that is necessary in order to succeed on a claim of defamation when the petitioning party, the claimant, the plaintiff, is a public figure. And from what I understand, Shirley Teeter in this case was deemed to be a public figure to the point where in order for her to succeed on her claim, she had to prove the actual malice of Project Veritas and James Okeefe in their coverage of her. The judge said no evidence has been made to that effect. We're not even going to give this to the jury to give them the opportunity to make a mistake on a judgment when evidence of the essential elements has not been adduced. And this is where we can get into some serious political bias, partisan interpretation of what went down. The judge who dismissed the lawsuit before it even got to the jury was appointed by George W. Bush, presumably a conservative judge appointed by a Republican George W. Bush, dismissing a lawsuit based on a directed verdict. A lawsuit filed by someone who is protesting Trump, suing a conservative news outlet for the coverage they did of the incident. One does not have to be overly empathetic or imaginative in order to switch the roles and then imagine how they would feel. If an Obama-appointed judge dismisses by directed verdict Nicholas Sandmann's lawsuit against Washington Post, CNN, NBC Universal, you can imagine that there's going to be a fair amount of people crying foul. And in this situation, I can easily imagine how some people are going to feel that this is, don't call it corruption, but call it favoritism, call it whatever you want. They're going to interpret what went on through the political blinders through which they see the world. That's just the nature of politics these days. It's unfortunate, but everybody sees the world through their political blinders and interprets what happens through those blinders. So conservatives are going to look at this judgment like the rule of law prevailing. They're going to be very happy and they're going to say, the system works. Liberals, Democrats are going to say, look at this, a conservative judge appointed by George W. Bush doesn't even let the jury come to its own decision. He has to cut it short through the mechanism known as a directed verdict because this conservative judge, in his eyes, didn't think that the plaintiff proved the essential elements of her case. Whatever. You know that that's what's going to happen. That's just the nature of the world we live in. And when I say this as a joke because nobody is perfectly objectively biased. Objectively biased? No, objectively neutral. And because I am perfectly objectively neutral, it is not a state of the spirit. It is an intellectual exercise. And I used to play this thought experiment with my clients all the time. Explain the adverse party's position to me as they would explain it. And so when I started looking into this in order just to understand it, I can understand how both sides are going to view this outcome. But I do not interpret this situation through political blinders. I leave that to you to interpret how you feel about what happened. All that I'm doing is giving you the information so that you know what happened. Because none of the articles I read talked about what a directed verdict was, let alone explained it. And so now, at the very least, if you get into a discussion with someone, you can have a slightly more educated discussion and hopefully come to a mutual understanding. And now you know your vlog. Peace out. Boom!